Rock of Ages, cleft for me. Knowledge held by ancient civilizations has been passed down through the ages by images graven in stone. That's because stone is one of the rare materials on Earth capable of resisting the passage of time. But what if the message from a stone does not lie in the drawings or symbols written on it, but rather in the position of the stone itself that seems to point the way to some hidden knowledge? It was still dark when the small group began to stir. At the head of the group was a gray-haired man. Flashlight in hand, the hikers walked carefully in the snow. Suddenly, their guide came to a stop. Before him were 3 small oblong stones standing upright. The other hikers gathered round, waiting for the moment, the signal. The sun finally appeared on the horizon. As the seconds ticked by, the sun's rays gently kissed these standing stones. One of them had 2 grooves in it, forming a V shape, and it was precisely along the line of one of these grooves that the sun was rising. The line from the other groove of the V ran north to south. Obviously, this was not sheer coincidence. Centuries ago, this location was designed to indicate the exact moment of the arrival of winter solstice. The men who designed it clearly depended on this celestial point of reference. But who were these ancient astronomers, and what message did they wish to leave behind? In order to paint a true picture of history, archaeologists must rely on vestiges from the past. But their job isn't always easy. At times, the objects provide more questions than answers. They are indeed stone mysteries. The end of the 1950s marked the golden era of UFOs. More and more authors began to question certain archaeological theories that had been generally accepted as historic facts. Who built the statues on Easter Island? How did the Egyptians build their pyramids? Who drew the lines on the Nazca Plains? And why? New interpretations were being offered. There was talk of visitors from outer space. The theory of ancient astronauts was born.
Well, the theory of ancient astronauts has a very long history. It started to become popular with the general public in 1960 when the Gallimard Publishing House in Paris released a book written by Louis Pauwels and Jacques Bergier called Morning of the Magician. It was a huge success, both on the bestseller list and with the critics. This success opened the door for other authors who had also adhered to this school of thinking, who had believed in this theory for a while, and who decided to take advantage of the fact that Pauwels and Bergier's book had made the bestseller list to publish their own. This was the case in France for author Robert Charroux. He wrote a lengthy hardcover book in 1963 dedicated solely to the theory of ancient astronauts. Then there were other cases in Germany, or rather Switzerland, I should say, like Erich von Däniken, who wrote an extremely successful bestseller in 1968 called Chariots of the Gods.
What other authors had suggested as possibilities, Erich von Däniken approached as statements of fact. He was convinced that ancient civilizations had developed far too quickly not to suspect the intervention of gods from another planet. Visits from outer space could not be doubted, maintained von Däniken, if you looked at all of the monuments erected by ancient civilizations that have long disappeared. How could we imagine that primitive civilizations were capable of raising blocks of stones weighing several tons, 147 meters into the air, to build the Great Pyramid of Egypt? How could the Mayans, who didn't even know how to use a wheel, have built their amazing cities hidden in the Yucatan jungle? How could anyone think that the Nazca Indians of Peru designed the incredible lines across the plains when these drawings can only be seen from the sky? To von Däniken and his supporters, there could only be one possible solution. These stone mysteries were proof that Earth was visited by aliens long ago.
With the arrival of a new generation of authors like Robert Bauval, Colin Wilson, and particularly Graham Hancock, the ancient astronaut theory was gradually put on the back burner. These new authors were still interested in the great historical mysteries raised by von Däniken, Charroux, and Bergier. The difference was that they didn't believe in the intervention of aliens from outer space. In their minds, the ancient gods were not beings from another planet, but rather representatives of a long-lost super-civilization like Atlantis or Mu. Between aliens and the super-civilization lies a gray area where many historians and amateur archaeologists have questioned the authenticity of history books. If we are to believe them, then long before Christopher Columbus arrived in North America, it was visited by explorers from Europe and Asia. These explorers included the Chinese, the Phoenicians, the Celts, and even the last representatives of the Order of the Knights Templar, the Pope's army that fought in the Crusades. All of these visitors supposedly left irrefutable proof of their journey to the New World, stone mysteries that merely needed to be decoded.
Regardless of whether the stone mysteries are a sign of visitors from outer space, or the heritage of a super-civilization, or of master navigators, most authors see traditional historians and archaeologists as the sources of a conspiracy designed to reassure the public by presenting a prefabricated history. Some authors even go so far as to accuse major museums of the world of hiding unusual artifacts that might shock visitors. Although the idea of super-civilizations, alien visitors, and mystical and historical conspiracies appeals to the minds of mystery lovers, unfortunately, these ideas are based on little evidence. Most scientists flatly reject speculations by authors of alternative archaeology theories, which they qualify as fanciful. Despite criticism from the science community, the public continues to gobble up these stories. It must be recognized that the history of ancient civilizations is dotted with gray areas and uncertainties that make it easy for authors like von Däniken, Charroux, and Hancock to find their niche. Their interpretation of events and the solutions they offer to explain structures and artifacts have the advantage of being much more entertaining than the often boring speeches given by archaeologists. But entertaining doesn't necessarily mean convincing.
I think people want to hear stories, and I'm not really sure why we all want to hear stories. Maybe it's something that goes way back. Perhaps hunters and gatherers wanted to be entertained by shamans and elders. There have always been storytellers in our society. Individuals whose role was to make up stories about things beyond our everyday existence. I imagine it has something to do with that.
Long before Bergier, Charroux, von Daniken, and Hancock, history was being made. A history that began some 5,000 years ago in the Middle East. Large civilizations of the ancient world and pre-Columbian America left behind incredible monuments and cities. Naturally, these large civilizations drew the attention of authors such as Eric von Daniken, Robert Charroux, and Graham Hancock, who were in search of a super civilization, whether it came from Atlantis or another planet.
A few kilometers west of Cairo lies the Giza Plateau, the site of the most wondrous structures in the world, the pyramids. The largest, the Pyramid of Cheops, was originally 147 meters tall. It has only dropped 10 meters from its initial height. It is made up of 2,300,000 blocks of stone, and its total weight is 6.5 tons. In von Daniken's opinion, the gigantic size of the structure was beyond human capability. Without the help of visitors from outer space, no civilization would have been able to undertake such a feat.
The structures on the Giza Plain are not the only ones to spark the interest of ancient archaeology lovers. Deeply buried in the Yucatan jungle, the large cities of Chichen Itza, Palenque, and Tikal testify to the splendor of the Mayan Empire. An indigenous civilization that at its peak had acquired an architectural brilliance unequaled in all of pre-Columbian America. Their knowledge of mathematics and astronomy is astonishing. For instance, the spectacular temple of Chichen Itza has 4 sets of 91 steps, plus a common walkway around a platform on which a temple was built. 91 steps times 4 equals 364. If we add the temple platform, we get a total of 365 steps. In other words, the exact number of days in a year. To proponents of the ancient astronaut theory, the Mayans' extensive knowledge of astronomy could only have come from a very ancient contact with mentors from another time and place. There's also the striking resemblance between the Mayan structures and the Egyptian ones, although these two civilizations were far removed from each other in time and space. Was it merely a coincidence?
For alternate archaeology enthusiasts, the immense size of the structure is not the only element that supports the theory of contact with an ancient super-civilization. According to von Daniken and Hancock, the major advocates of this new improved version of history, the sudden and spontaneous development of large civilizations, like the Sumerians, Egyptians, and Mayans, are as inexplicable as the megastructures linked to them. John Anthony West, one of the researchers behind the controversy over the real age of the Giza Sphinx, said the following about the ancient Egyptians. How does a complex civilization spring full-blown into being? Look at a 1905 automobile and compare it to a modern one. There is no mistaking the process of development. But in Egypt, there are no parallels. Everything is right there at the start. In West's eyes, it's as if the first vehicle to come out of Egyptian factories was a modern Rolls-Royce. In addition to the spontaneity and development, there was also the pictorial art, as if artists back in ancient times all came up with the same trend, whether it be rock paintings in Val Camonica, Mayan sculptures in Palenque, Mexico, or native drawings at Lake Christina in Canada. All of these artistic expressions depict curious-looking individuals dressed like astronauts and strange flying machines like those found in modern-day UFO stories.
Christina Lake in southwest British Columbia is quite isolated. It's in the interior. There are many paintings there. One of them is a very large, we call it flying saucer. That's what it looks like. It looks like the outline of a flying saucer with radiation coming out or with legs or tripods or something sticking down. John McGore was a journalist, covered the press gallery in Ottawa, and he described for me over dinner one evening the elation he felt looking at this, because he felt here was objective evidence of, prior to contact, the landing of a UFO, because the painting itself showed very clearly human figures, dwarfed human figures alongside this kind of miraculous looking image. And I must say, you can support the theory. He circulated two versions of it, one the original photograph, which he made available, and the other a drawing based on it to highlight some of the features. The drawing looks rather more like a UFO than the original, and the original itself is not inconsistent with motifs of the natives of the region.
For many, the idea of contact with aliens from outer space or representatives of a super civilization like Atlantis is too fanciful to possibly be real. What if the contact was of a different nature? Isn't it possible that sporadic exchanges between culturally distant societies could have led to the building of this type of anachronistic structure?
What we refer to as the establishment in the field of history, in other words, archaeology and anthropology for all of North America. I don't mean just for here. Well, individuals in those fields think that the first contact with Europe came by means of Christopher Columbus and other explorers like Verrazano, Champlain, Jacques Cartier, Maisonneuve, etc. Before them, there wasn't anyone else. But now we are finding vestiges of other cultures, Celtic, Viking, and Finnish cultures. Okay, it was already known that there were vestiges of the Viking culture in Newfoundland, but vestiges were also found in places other than Newfoundland, and those vestiges were rejected.
In 1910, in Bramptonville, Quebec, workers building a new church discovered two large stones bearing inscriptions that were two rows of vertical lines crisscrossing to form a series of V's, W's, and X's. The stones were eventually sent to the Séminaire Saint-Charles de Borromée in Sherbrooke, where they are still on display in the seminary's museum. Since they were first discovered, these mysterious tablets have continued to attract mystery lovers, both professional and amateur. In 1966, Dr. Thomas Lee, an archaeologist with the Center for Northern Studies at Laval University, began studying the petroglyphs. For 9 years, he tried in vain to arouse his colleagues' interest regarding the mystery of the stones from Sherbrooke. Then in 1975, Professor Barry Fell of Harvard University said that he had finally figured out the origin of the inscriptions.
Barry Fell paved the way for researchers who were interested in explaining the presence of stone ruins and vestiges that were found throughout New England and Quebec. He came up with his theory about the Celts. He could understand Celtic symbols and writing to the point where he could actually translate them a bit. So he came up with his theory, that was highly controversial, mind you, claiming that the Celts had been in North America in prehistoric times. In other words, about 2,000 to 3,000 years ago.
According to Fell, it was an ancient Egyptian dialect spoken in Libya 500 years before Christ. And since the code was not cracked until 1972, it was practically impossible that a stone discovered at the beginning of the century, bearing inscriptions of this dialect, could be a hoax.
Nowadays, not too many folks continue to agree with Professor Fell's findings and translation. Some experts believe that these characters are nothing more than marks left by erosion. This interpretation is just as controversial as Professor Fell's. Others believe that the inscriptions might be Ogham, a primitive form of writing developed by the Celts.
The Sherbrooke stones were not the only artifacts proving the existence of an ancient Celtic civilization in North America. Researcher Gérard Leduc has drawn up a list of several sites where odd stone structures or petroglyphs suggest a European presence long before the first colonists arrived in the 16th century.
Petroglyphs are a very powerful cultural indicator. especially when we find them inscribed on local stones. I'm talking about huge stones, rocks, that were not brought into the area by someone. If the inscription was on a small stone, then we could just say, sure, they brought this stone here from such and such a place. But when you find, it's like a signature carved into stone. It identifies the person or culture. Nowadays, we can identify Ogham cultures. That's O-G-A-M. Ogham was a writing form used by Celtic tribes, and we found several inscriptions made by them over a large area. It's quite extraordinary.
These same explorers may also be responsible for one of the most amazing stone mysteries in North America, Mystery Hill.
Located near North Salem, New Hampshire, Mystery Hill is a collection of chambers, caves, and low walls built like burial mounds found throughout Western Europe, some of which date back 5,000 years. The site, which covers an area of more than 12 hectares, has been known for generations and no one really knows how it got there. Carbon-14 testing done on pieces of wood found between the rocks has shown that the site may have been built 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. The fact that some stones appear to be aligned with certain astronomical events, just like Stonehenge, seems to support the theory that the site is of European origin. It came as no surprise when the site was officially renamed America's Stonehenge. Back in the 1970s, Dr. Barry Fell, who was also involved in the Sherbrooke Stone mystery, spent a lot of time studying Mystery Hill. He found stones bearing symbols that appeared to be Ogham, the writing system developed by the Celts. According to Fell, a group of explorers from northern England could have built and possibly inhabited the site between 800 BC and 300 AD.
Structures like those seen at Mystery Hill can be found at other locations along the eastern coast of North America. Canadian author Michael Bradley lists a few of those locations in his book. In Newport, Rhode Island, there's a large stone tower which is reminiscent of churches in Northern Europe. The first references to this tower date back to 1632, but Michael Bradley thinks that it might have been built centuries earlier by European masons.
There are many vestiges other than just petroglyphs, and it's obvious that they are of human origin. I'm referring to stone walls, foundations, dolmens, and stone mounds, for instance. But all of those have been attributed to the first colonists of the 19th century for some reason. No one seems to want to consider any other possibilities.
When it comes to the history of ancient civilizations, or of the Incas from Peru, or even North American natives, nothing should be assumed. Archaeological digs have apparently uncovered items that traditional history is unable to account for. Could they signify visits from outer space? A super civilization that disappeared? Or the presence of builders that came over from Europe long before Christopher Columbus? Books like The Morning of the Magicians by Louis Pauwels and Jacques Bergier, Gods from Outer Space by Eric Van Daniken, and Footprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock were sharply criticized by professional archaeologists. Some even wrote counter-articles, arguing point by point the speculations put forth by these popular authors.
Since the publication of the first books on the theory of ancient astronauts, scientists and researchers have been desperately trying to show that this theory, or the so-called proof of this theory, is false. For every site and monument mentioned as proof that aliens have visited Earth, they have come up with a very simple, rational explanation that did not require the intervention of beings from outer space.
Aucune intervention d'êtres venus du cosmos.
However, the public has remained skeptical about the arguments put forth by scientists. They have continued to believe in the theory of ancient astronauts despite efforts to disprove it.
Les anciens astronautes.
The Great Pyramid of Cheops, built 4,500 years ago, is the only one of the 7 wonders of the world still visible today. Unfortunately, archaeological research does not leave much room for mystery. When authors like von Daniken and Charroux say that the structures were humanly impossible, they are seriously twisting the facts. Egyptians had both the material and manpower necessary to build the pyramids. They also had the know-how to carry out this task.
The Giza Plateau, where the 3 large pyramids of the 4th dynasty were constructed, lies over a huge limestone deposit, which was available for the builders. So it was there, ready to be used, ready to be exploited. The real problem was to organize the workers to cut out the blocks of limestone and carry them up to the construction sites. That was a real challenge, that's true. But it's not something that required the intervention of aliens from outer space or people from another race or mythical culture like Atlantis, for instance.
Contrary to claims made by these popular authors, the first Egyptian pyramids built were far from the masterpieces seen on the Giza Plain.
The Egyptians did not build this pyramid in one single shot. They made several attempts beforehand. They started off with a structure that was somewhat rectangular in shape with different levels, and they saw that it wasn't really what they wanted. They went through about 5 or 6 phases of construction while they were building this pyramid. Along the way, they acquired the techniques that they needed to build the next pyramids. If someone had telegraphed these pyramid building instructions to the Egyptians, well, they probably would have been able to build the pyramids with no problem at all, starting with the very first one.
As we can see, the architecture of the pyramids was a process that developed gradually over time. They didn't appear magically overnight. That is far from the concept of master architects suggested by von Daniken and others.
The theory that the Giza Plateau pyramids were built in exact alignment with the constellation of Orion has also come under criticism by professional archaeologists. In his book, First Civilizations, archaeologist Robert Chadwick addresses these speculations with a certain degree of humor. Let's start with Robert Bauval and his theory about the correlation between the pyramids and the stars. He mentioned that they were these shafts or tunnels inside the Great Pyramid. But if these shafts were allegedly used for stargazing or alignment, since the theory is that the shafts were used to align the pyramids with the stars of Orion's belt, then he forgot to mention or clearly explain the fact that you can't see anything in these so-called star shafts. If you go to the center of the pyramid, to the largest chamber, which is referred to as the King's Chamber, then you will be very disappointed since the shafts are blocked off. They are curved at a 45-degree angle just before entering the King's Chamber itself. So there's no way that they could ever have been used for stargazing or aligning the pyramids with the stars in Orion's belt.
The pronounced erosion of the Sphinx was an indication to Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval that the monument had been sculpted more than 10,000 years ago by a super civilization. Geologists and archaeologists don't see anything mysterious about the erosion. To give weight to their theory, Hancock and Bauval turned to the work of Robert Schoch, a Boston University geologist who concluded in 1991 that the signs of erosion on the Sphinx were characteristic of water erosion. According to their logic, since Egypt's dry climate has remained basically unchanged for over 5,000 years, construction of the monument must date back before that period. The problem with this type of dating method is that it favors a borderline point of view rather than a quasi-unanimous one. Most geologists think that the abnormal erosion of the Sphinx is due to the nature of the rocks with which it was built, and not some massive downpour at the end of the Ice Age.
Von Daniken, Charroux, and Hancock all perceived past societies as primitive. Giving them credit for having built such spectacular structures as the Great Pyramids or the temples of Chichen Itza makes no sense to these authors. Society supports dissenters, even when they're wrong. The city of Tiahuanaco, Bolivia, is a classic example of this twisted way of thinking. To justify their far-fetched theories, von Daniken and Hancock relied on the works of Austrian engineer Arthur Poznański, who led many studies into the Tiahuanaco site during the first half of the 20th century. To date its construction, the engineer decided that the Grand Temple, Kalasasaya, must have been built in correlation to the position of the rising sun during summer solstice. Since the Earth's axis changes very slowly and Kalasasaya was slightly off-axis, Poznański concluded that the city must have been built around 10,000 BC. Back then, no civilization had developed the logistics required to forge such a city, hence von Daniken and Hancock's interest in Poznański's assessments. The problem is that the Austrian engineer stands alone in his beliefs. Archaeological research into the Tiahuanaco site shows that the city was built in 3 consecutive phases, extending from 1000 BC to 1200 AD. That hardly fits with von Daniken's alien theory or Hancock's super-civilization theory.
Les extraterrestres de von Daniken ou la super-civilisation de Hancock.
Of course, historians don't hold all the answers, but any uncertainties still circulating about archaeological mysteries don't seem to point to the alien visitors suggested by von Daniken or the super-civilization suggested by Hancock.
Les sites sont impressionnants.
The sites are quite impressive, if I do say so myself. The Mayas built cities in the jungle, and the Incas built huge cities high on the plateau in the mountains. They had building techniques that were absolutely incredible. In general, archaeologists have been able to describe and understand these techniques. What we know now, what's important to note, is that in the New World, metals were not used for construction purposes until the arrival of the whites. In other words, the Spaniards. Before that, gold, silver, and copper were used to make ornaments and a lot of other things. But only carved stones were used to build structures, to create their cities. In my opinion, there are some things that are harder to explain, but they don't relate to construction. For instance, there are the famous Nazca lines, which are geometric patterns that represent animals. Some people say that they were designed to be aircraft runways, but I don't think that's right. I don't really buy that theory. At any rate, they are so enormous that you have to be up in the air to see them, to see the shapes that the lines form. So that's much harder for an archaeologist, or anyone else for that matter, to explain.
The presence of Celts in North America before Christopher Columbus is a whole other matter. Up until now, other than the vestiges of Vikings clearly identified in Los Olmedos, no one has ever come forward with indisputable proof of their so-called presence.
Beyond the legends and anecdotes, so-called artifacts like the Sherbrooke stones or any other Ogham inscriptions remain highly controversial. It must be understood that Ogham consists of strokes and notches that form lines. The Ogham alphabet is so simplistic that the slightest marks on a stone could be interpreted as Ogham. Sites like Mystery Hill and the Newport Tower raise legitimate doubts. Mystery Hill, for example, was never heard of until 1826, when Jonathan Pattee, a farmer from North Salem, New Hampshire, decided to build a farm on the site. There are no historical references to the site until Pattee arrived. Since then, of course, the site has been researched thoroughly. Over the years, it has been described as the site of an ancient monastery, built sometime around the 9th or 10th century, or the vestiges of a pre-Viking village or Phoenician ruins, or even a site created by Jonathan Pattee himself. The problem with a site like Mystery Hill is that it's very difficult to date with any degree of accuracy. There is no known method for dating stone, as opposed to organic material like wood, natural fibers, and human remains, which can be dated using carbon-14 testing. In other words, the structures found at Mystery Hill could have been built 1,000 years ago by travelers from Europe as easily as they could have been built by Irish immigrants settling in the region 250 years ago. New Hampshire is known for the large number of Irish immigrants that arrived around 1600. As for the wooden artifacts found on the site, their dating is so inconsistent that it is impossible to come to any definite conclusions.
Up until now, there has been little evidence of the alien visits suggested by von Daniken or the super-civilization proposed by Graham Hancock. On the other hand, the debate over the presence of Europeans in North America before Columbus has been based on a series of stories, documents, and intriguing artifacts.
In its archive collection, Yale University has a map that stands apart from the rest. It was drawn somewhere around 1440, in other words, 50 years before the arrival of Christopher Columbus, and is a copy of a Viking map that is actually much older. In the upper right-hand corner lies Greenland, but the map also includes part of Canada's eastern coast, referred to as Vinland, or Wineland. If the document is authentic, and there is a huge debate over this, then it would be the first pre-Columbian document establishing knowledge of the New World prior to 1492. Of course, we already know that the Vikings briefly set up a small colony in Anse aux Meadows, Newfoundland, around the year 1000, proof that they were already aware of the New World at that time. But if this map of Vinland is authentic, then it implies that the Vikings' knowledge of this land may have circulated throughout Europe and led other sailors to what was to become North America.
This map of Vinland isn't the only one of its kind. There is another document called the Zeno map, which was published in 1558 in a book by Niccolo Zeno, which described a voyage. In the introduction, the author states that the story and the map were produced by his ancestors, Antonio and Niccolo Zeno, two Venetian navigators who were well known around the end of the 14th century.
The maps made by the Zeno brothers had been in their family for about 150 years. What was special about these maps was the fact that they illustrated the northern hemisphere, including England, a part of the coast of Iceland, part of Greenland, some of the coast of Labrador, and also an unknown block of land referred to as Istotiland. Nowadays, we know that Istotiland corresponds to what we refer to as Nova Scotia.
If the map of Vinland and the Zeno brothers' map are authentic, then it is clear that European navigators knew of the existence of the New World during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period. But who were these explorers? Among the most popular candidates are the Order of the Knights Templar and a mysterious prince of Scotland, Henry Sinclair. More recently, Cape Breton architect Paul Chiasson added the Chinese to the already extensive list of pre-Columbian visitors to North America. He claims that in the summer of 2003, he discovered ruins which prove that Chinese explorers established a colony on Cape Breton in the 13th century. Other than the Viking presence in Anse aux Meadows, is it possible that small groups from Europe or China could have explored the New World centuries before Christopher Columbus?
Despite these major disparities, the theory of contact between the Old World and the New World cannot be easily dismissed. In the 1940s, Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl proposed that perhaps Easter Island had originally been inhabited by Aboriginal peoples from Peru rather than settlers from the West, as anthropologists were claiming at the time. Heyerdahl's theory was politely dismissed. According to experts, Aboriginals from Peru did not have sturdy balsam ships required for such a journey. They only had primitive reed boats, But Heyerdahl remains skeptical. In his mind, reed boats, particularly the ones used to navigate Lake Titicaca, could have done the job. In 1947, the explorer built a reed boat using the same materials and techniques as ancient Peruvians. He then set out on the Kon-Tiki with 5 companions and a parrot for a journey across the Pacific. 101 days later, Heyerdahl landed on the Roroya Atoll east of Tahiti. The Kon-Tiki adventure had just proven that exchanges between South America and the Polynesian islands had been possible in the past.
Thor Heyerdahl's journeys proved beyond a doubt that materials from ancient times could have been used for sporadic exchanges between the peoples of North America, Europe, and even Africa. But there's a difference between a possibility and an established fact. Although Heyerdahl showed that such voyages were feasible, nothing proves that the exchanges actually took place.
There was a lot of contact in antiquity, a lot of business trade and exchanges between different societies. In general, exchanges back then were relatively limited compared with today's world. We're talking mostly about cultures that lived around the Mediterranean Sea. So you had exchanges between the Egyptians and the Greeks, for instance, as well as other civilizations living in that area.
Although many civilizations in Central America have legends of incredible men arriving by sea, this doesn't mean that all of these indigenous tribes received visitors from the Middle East.
In my opinion, the first step is to show that there could have been contact. As I said earlier, it's a possibility that is totally reasonable to entertain. The Basques definitely landed at Lanzo Meadows, Newfoundland. Of that, we're absolutely certain, long before Jacques Cartier came on the scene. Some things have been clearly demonstrated, but we need to go further than that. Proving that there was contact doesn't mean proving that the contact led to some sort of social or cultural development. First, you start with an observation that there was contact. Then you have to try and understand what effect the contact might have had on the society that you were studying.
Before history books can be rewritten, archaeologists will need more than simple theories. For now, ideas that contact existed between the Old World and the New World are purely speculation. History has been strewn with stone mysteries, structures beyond comprehension, or that appear to be out of place and out of time. To explain them, some people look to alien visitors or descendants of an amazing super-civilization. Others, more reserved, have imagined that there was contact between different civilizations. Although this latter theory may seem more likely, it still needs to be backed up with concrete and indisputable proof.
I would say that it lies within the realm of possibility. But I have my doubts, for many reasons. First of all, it would mean that people from here were not intelligent enough to develop their own civilization. I find that a bit arrogant, if you will, from an ethnic or cultural perspective. It implies that only the European whites, the Egyptians, the Sumerians, and the Chinese, for that matter, were capable of creating a civilization and exporting it.
Dans toute cette controverse, il faut se rappeler surtout que les hommes de
At the heart of this debate, we should bear in mind that people who lived in ancient times were no less intelligent than modern man. Naturally, they didn't have any modern-day technology, but their ingenuity helped them overcome obstacles. Medieval masons and architects who built colossal structures like the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, the city of Angkor Wat in Cambodia, or the Potala Palace in Tibet did not have modern technology either. But no one has remotely entertained the thought that these wonders were in any way attributable to aliens. No more so than we would attribute the building of the Great Wall of China to representatives from Atlantis. And yet, this wall extends for more than 1,900 kilometers, long enough to link London to Moscow, and holds enough stone blocks to build 30 pyramids the size of Cheops.
construire 30 pyramides comme celle de Khéops.
Many stories and documents explain how large cathedrals and the Great Wall of China were built. On the other hand, there doesn't seem to be much documentation on how the Great Pyramids of Egypt or the Mayan temples were built. This gap leaves the door wide open to the wildest speculations. As long as there is no absolute certainty about the great stone mysteries, they will continue to play upon the imaginations of those interested in alternative archaeology. Perhaps one day we will discover that they hold the key to wondrous alien visits, or the lost continent of Atlantis, or to Celts who came to settle in the New World. Or perhaps they were simply built by men driven to excel.
Désir de se surpasser.